The Normandy landings of the 6th of June 1944 was the Allied operation codenamed Overlord that led to the successful liberation of German-occupied Western Europe. But a claim that Churchill tried to sabotage the D-Day landings is not only a bold one, but one which many will find difficult to believe. After all, he's the man who saved Britain from invasion by Nazi Germany, isn't he? The conventional view of World War II is based on what we see on TV and are taught in school, most of which is factually untrue. It's Mills and Boon with Spitfires, says Greenock-based author and World War II historian Dr. Graeme Bowman.
The mainstream view of World War II is basically sold to us as Mills and Boon with Spitfires, and we've got this ridiculous notion of Churchill as the greatest human being who ever lived. And also, the main thing that people want us to take away from all these World War II documentaries is brave little Britain battling alone in 1940. But we're also told that Britain was the greatest empire the world has ever known. So I find it kind of difficult to reconcile these things. So in this book, the empire is front and centre. And unlike most books on World War II that start with appeasement or Hitler coming to power in the 30s, my book starts in the 1870s with Churchill's birth and Disraeli buying shares in the Suez Canal Company. And because I've got that much longer perspective, that reveals patterns and trends that are concealed from other writers who've got a smaller perspective, and that's why my book is so different.
Dr. Bowman has always been interested in history, but he admits, like most other people, he had also been taken in by the traditional narrative surrounding World War II and Churchill's role in it.
I always loved history. When my mum got me to join the local library, my favourite books that I chose were Myths and Legends of Ancient Greece and Rome. So I've always been a bit of a history geek. I got a first class honours degree from Strathclyde University in history, an MA in history from Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, and I completed a doctorate in history from King's College, Cambridge in history. So I'm a history geek, but I'd never really studied World War II in depth because I'd sort of grown up as a member of the Apex generation. My childhood was saturated with World War II. So I grew up with a very conventional, uncritical view of the war and Churchill's role in it.
However, his understanding of World War II history was challenged after investigating a claim in a book by historian Sir Basil Liddell Hart that the foreign ministers of Germany and the Soviet Union met in neutral Sweden in the summer of 1943 to discuss a separate peace, because the Russians believed that the Western Allies were dragging their feet in opening up a second front in Europe. Whilst that claim was shown to be without foundation, Dr. Bowman's research led him to discover the extent of Churchill's covert opposition to the D-Day landings.
It became clear there was no face-to-face meeting between Molotov and Ribbentrop in 1943, but there was, in the archives I looked at, there was lots more information about low-level contacts between Soviets and Nazis in neutral Sweden, particularly in the first half of 1943. Between the battles of Stalingrad and Kursk, where there was a sort of equilibrium in the Eastern Front, and when things are balanced out and equal, that's when you can do deals. So there were low-level contacts between the Nazis and the Soviets in neutral Sweden because both countries had embassies there, and if it's low-level people, you can easily disown them. Then I began to ask, why, after 2 years of the most extreme Nazi barbarism and atrocities on the Soviet people, why would Stalin entertain the idea of a separate peace on these? Why would he want to do a deal with Hitler? And it was because Stalin believed that Britain and America were dragging their feet over the opening of a second front in Europe. Now again, growing up a conventional view of World War II, I had no idea there was a debate about the timing and location of the second front. So I started to investigate this, and it became clear very quickly that you could not accuse America of dragging its feet over opening a second front of northwestern Europe. Right from the earliest days of their involvement in World War II, the Americans knew that landing somewhere in northwestern Europe was the best way to contribute towards Hitler's defeat in the West. What I discovered was it was Britain, it was Churchill who was dragging his feet over launching the second front in northwestern Europe. Now again, this clashed with everything I'd been brought up with Churchill. He was the scourge of Nazism, the champion of democracy. He was the champion of liberty. I'd always believed that he'd led this crusade to liberate Europe from fascism, but as I started to dig into it, I thought, hold on, this isn't true.
Dr. Bowman's research led to a 15-year investigation, delving into archives to discover why Churchill was against Operation Overlord, and how he had sought to undermine it by drawing military resources into the Mediterranean theatre instead. Dr. Bowman recognises that completely transforming how people view World War II and Churchill is quite a big challenge, but his book has been endorsed by some respected historians.
I like a challenge, and the idea of completely transforming how people view World War II and Churchill, yes, it's quite a big task, but that'll keep me active, and I enjoy the challenge. I would like to say first of all that I work outside of the academy. I'm not affiliated with a university, but I've been really lucky in the fact that some highly respected historians have very kindly endorsed the book. I'd like to say a huge big thanks to Professor Gerhard Weinberg, who is an emeritus professor at the University of North Carolina. I caught one of his interviews on YouTube and I was really taken with him. So out of the blue I just emailed him and said, would you like to read my book because I think it might interest you? And he got back to me and he said, yeah, I'll have a look at it might take me a wee while. So I sent it off to him as a manuscript and he got back to me within about 4 or 5 weeks and he's been hugely positive about the book. He was the first academic to get behind it and appreciate its genius. I've also been very fortunate in that Professor Richard Overy, who, if you've watched any serious documentaries about World War II, you'll have seen him. He is one of the world's foremost scholars in World War II. He's very kindly given it a shining endorsement. And of course, Professor Tom Devine, who supervised my undergraduate dissertation at Strathclyde. I thought, I wonder if he'll remember me. So I contacted him through his Edinburgh University email. Yes, he did remember me. And although his specialism is a social and economic history looking at Ireland and Scotland, he is a closet World War II enthusiast. He's read the Allenbrook diaries 3 times. So I sent it through to him, and I'm hugely grateful that Professor Devine was kind enough to give me a glowing endorsement. So that sort of support and interest really encourages you, because these are serious scholars with credibility. Well, with a lot of conventional mainstream histories of World War II, the Empire makes a very minimal appearance. And that's bonkers because the Empire was at the core of Churchill's identity. George VI was Rex et Imperator, King and Emperor. Allenbrook, he wasn't the chief of the General Staff, he was chief of the Imperial General Staff. The Empire was a living, breathing thing for the men who were shaping British strategy in World War II. And that's the reason my book is better than most other books on the subject is because I start in the 1870s and I show that I clearly demonstrate that controlling Suez and the Eastern Mediterranean was absolutely vital to Britain's future as an empire. All the empire's most valuable real estate was located east of Suez. So, for example, you've got India, which on its own contained about 3/4 of the empire's total population. You've got Malaya, which in 1914 produced about 40% of the world's rubber and tin. And of course, Britain gets all its oil from the Middle East through Suez and the east of the Mediterranean. So that was the fulcrum, the carotid artery, the jugular vein of the British Empire. If you don't control Suez and the Eastern Mediterranean, you don't have an empire. And this need to control the Eastern Mediterranean, it was hardwired into the DNA of every statesman of Churchill's generation. And so when World War II happened, obviously Churchill correctly identified the need to defend Britain's island security. After that, he was obsessed with maintaining the empire as a British lake. In the presentation I do on this subject, there's a great quote from a Bristol newspaper, and it says something to the effect of the Mediterranean is an English lake, and Suez is just like the Thames and the Mersey. And in April 1945, Anthony Eden, who was Churchill's foreign minister, wrote a paper in which he basically said that controlling the Eastern Mediterranean is a matter of life and death for the British Empire. Life and death. You don't get much more serious than that. So the whole need to defend Suez and Eastern Mediterranean, it was hardwired into the DNA of statesmen such as Churchill and Eden. So once Britain survived the threat to its own island security, it was back, in many ways, it was back to business as usual. And Churchill's business, his core business, was always defending, protecting, and extending the empire. So one of the probably the most significant battle in the European theatre, other than perhaps D-Day, was the Red Army's victory at the Battle of Kursk in July 1943. That transformed the situation on the Eastern Front, because from that point onwards, the Red Army was the dominant force in the Eastern Front. Germany could look forward to 2 years of constant retreat all the way back to Berlin. Now, for Churchill, Eden, and Britain's ruling elite, this transformative Soviet victory at the Battle of Kursk was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it meant that the Allies would win the war, because about at least 85% of Germany's battlefield casualties in World War II occurred in the Eastern Front. So if they've lost control of the most important front in the European theatre, they're not going to win the war. So Kursk means the Allies will win the war. But what if the Red Army rolls into Yugoslavia or Greece or Albania with their extensive Mediterranean coastlines? What if these places become part of Stalin's sphere of influence? What if he starts building air and naval bases in these places? Now, the idea of Soviet ships and aircraft having free access to the Mediterranean so close to Suez was Churchill's nightmare. So I'd argue that particularly from July 1943 onwards, Churchill was more interested in blocking Stalin in the Balkans than in liberating Western Europe from fascism. And that's why he opposed Overlord, because if Overlord goes ahead and becomes the primary Western Allied effort, it will absorb all the resources Churchill needs to block Stalin in the Balkans. So Churchill is continually selling this myth of the soft underbelly. That's how he described Southern Europe, the soft underbelly. Now, if you just look at a topographical map of Europe, you'll realise that is the most ridiculous nonsense ever. Northern Europe is dominated by the North European plain. It's lovely and flat all the way from the Atlantic coast to the Ural Mountains. Southern Europe is completely, with one exception, Nazi-occupied Southern Europe is completely dominated by mountains, and that is the worst place in the world to fight the German army, because they'll have control over the high ground, and you cannot practice mobile offensive warfare in mountainous terrain. So why was Churchill trying to pitch? Basically, Southern Europe is the opposite of a soft underbelly. In fact, when Alanbrooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, visited Italy in December 1943, he compared the terrain to the northwest frontier of India, which, as we all know, is rather rough and unfavourable to attacking forces. So you have to ask yourself, why did Churchill try to pitch this inhospitable mountainous terrain as a soft underbelly? Well, it was all part of a dodgy salesman's pitch to try and convince Stalin and Roosevelt to invest resources into Southern Europe, which was a dead-end theatre for the Allies in terms of defeating Germany, but it would have been of great benefit to Britain in terms of maintaining the Mediterranean as a British lake and keeping the Soviets out. That was Churchill's top priority: keep the Soviets away from direct access to the Mediterranean, and that's what led him to oppose Overlord. So if Churchill's going to thwart Overlord and prioritise the Mediterranean, he faced two big challenges and he also had two big opportunities. So, looking at the challenges, firstly, Britain is no longer a true global superpower by 1943. The Americans and the Soviets were much stronger militarily. So he can't really openly oppose or block Overlord. Britain is extremely dependent on American lend-lease to continue fighting the war. So Britain cannot open, and America favoured a landing in northwestern Europe. So Britain cannot openly propose alternative strategies. The other thing as well is if Britain and America don't deliver a second front in northwestern Europe in 1944, the alliance with Stalin is dead, because he'd been calling for a second front in northwestern Europe since July 1941. He thought it was going to happen in summer 1943. When it didn't happen, he was furious, and he was so angry he withdrew his two pro-Western ambassadors from Washington and London and replaced them with Kremlin hardline apparatchiks. So if Britain and America don't deliver a second front in 1944, then it's entirely feasible that Stalin might explore the possibility of a separate peace on the Eastern Front with Germany, and if that happens, it will be a disaster for Britain and America. So Churchill couldn't openly oppose or block Overlord. He had to employ more subtle, underhand, covert methods. So in 1943, there were two big Anglo-American conferences, Trident and Quadrant. Trident was in May 43, Quadrant was in August 1943. So in his face-to-face contacts with Roosevelt and the American Army Chief of Staff, Churchill would reluctantly, he'd already agreed that Overlord would be the defining Allied operation for summer 1944, because he was dependent on American aid. He'd agreed face-to-face and in written documents that Overlord, a landing in northwestern Europe, would be the big Allied operation for summer 1944. But away from those face-to-face meetings with the Americans, he practiced a very different strategy. Churchill and Allenbrook they dismissed these agreements with the Americans as lawyers' agreements, things that could be renegotiated. So once he was away from contact with the Americans and he was back in Whitehall, there are a number of documents where his opposition to Overlord is very clear. I think probably the best exemplar of that was from October 19th, 1943, a Chiefs of Staff meeting, and Churchill made it very clear that if Britain was able to set Allied military strategy, the top three priorities would be Italy, the Aegean and the Balkans. And you know the funny thing is, when Churchill wrote his 6-volume history of World War II, which had lots and lots of documents, papers which confirmed his profound opposition to Overlord seem to have been mislaid. They just don't appear in it. And that's why we've got this false narrative about World War II, which still informs current thinking. Churchill excluded all the documents showing his antipathy, his opposition, his aversion to Overlord from his account of World War II. And because he was one of the first big authors to publish on World War II, and because he had a lot of credibility as Britain's Prime Minister, that misleading view of the war took root and it's been perpetuated. So Churchill couldn't openly oppose or block Overlord, So I argue that he employed what we would call Mediterranean mission creep. Although the Allies had kicked the Axis out of Africa in May 1943, that's just too late in the year to launch a cross-channel assault in 1943, and you can only safely launch an amphibious operation in northwestern Europe between May and September. Outside of the summer months, the wind, the weather, the water, they're just too choppy, rough and unpredictable. So Churchill has an 8 or 9 month breathing space, a window, between summer 1943 and spring 1944, where he can try and divert Allied strategy to his ends. And of course, because there can't be any cross-channel assault in 1943, the Allies, Western Allies, can't stand idle for a year. So they land in Sicily in July 43 and cross into mainland Italy in September. So they're fighting in his preferred theatre. So one of my big arguments is that in this period between summer 43 and spring 44, he authorised 2 Mediterranean operations, hoping that he would achieve a major Mediterranean breakthrough before the momentum behind Overlord became unstoppable. Because if that happened, it would put the Americans under tremendous pressure to allocate resources to exploit that breakthrough. And those resources could only come from Overlord. So Churchill pushed through 2 incompetently organised operations to try and bog the Allies down in the Mediterranean and undermine Overlord by covert, subtle, underhand methods. And I further argue that because he was motivated, these 2 operations were motivated by political goals, defending the empire, rather than sound military objectives, defeating Germany. The 2 operations that he authorised, one in the Aegean, one in Italy, were master classes in incompetent planning, flawed assumptions about the enemy's response, and they were inadequately resourced. As a result, both operations failed disastrously. And I would argue that the 50,000 young men who were killed, wounded or captured in these operations were victims of Churchillian incompetence and Imperial obsession. And in the ledger of his reputational account, both these operations, Accolade and Anzio, are major stains on his legacy.
There is plenty of evidence that Britain's ruling elite were obsessed with defending the empire at all costs, says Dr. Bowman, who adds that his book is entirely evidence-led.
So I think one of the things that distinguishes my book is that the argument, the analysis, it's entirely evidence-led. The book is 520 pages long, 450 pages of writing and 70 pages of bibliography and references. So everything I say in this book is backed up by evidence, documents from the period, archival material. Now, it comes in various shapes. I start my analysis in 1874-75, so I provide lots of evidence that Britain's ruling elite were obsessed with controlling Suez and the Eastern Mediterranean. Lots of quotes, which, for example, in his book Masters and Commanders, Andrew Roberts says that controlling the Mediterranean had not been a British policy since Nelson's day. Well, in one of my chapters, I've got quotes from multiple British Prime Ministers, Labour and Tory, and Commonwealth Prime Ministers saying just how important controlling Suez and the Mediterranean was to Britain. Then when we go to World War II, we've got examples of Churchill before war starts. He says that the Mediterranean must be England's first battlefield. He wanted to prioritise Italy rather than Germany. Mussolini joined the war in June 1940. In August 1940, Italian troops had advanced 60 miles into Egypt, presenting a threat to the Suez Canal. So even before the Battle of Britain is won, when Britain is facing the prospect of invasion, Churchill sends huge amounts of Britain's remaining military supplies to Egypt to make sure that Egypt does not fall under Italian control. So he's perpetually obsessed with defending Egypt, Suez and the Mediterranean. There's also a record of his conversations with the American War Secretary, Henry Stimson, in July 1943, and Stimson wrote a very extensive diary, and he records these conversations with Churchill when Churchill makes it clear that he is not a supporter of Overlord, that would, if he was allowed to shape Allied strategy, they would not be going into northwestern Europe. And that's one of the reasons why Stimson tells Roosevelt that an American needs to lead the Overlord campaign, because he thinks that the British hierarchy are dominated by the shadows of Dunkirk and Passchendaele. We've also got documents such as the October 1943 Chiefs of Staff meeting, where Churchill makes it clear that if Britain was shaping Allied strategy, their top three priorities would all be Mediterranean. There are multiple documents written by the Chiefs of Staff which make it clear their lack of enthusiasm for landings in northwestern Europe. In one document, they even say we don't have to specify how many divisions will be used in the landing in northwestern Europe, and we don't even need a date for it, which is ridiculous. The British approach to planning was much more ad hoc than the Americans. The Americans knew that a big, very risky operation like Overlord needed a deadline that everyone could work towards, because it was hugely complex. The British were extremely reluctant to commit to that. And I would like to read one quote that's attributed to Churchill that further underlines what his true strategies and preferences were. So he had a chat with a group of Dominion Prime Ministers on the 3rd of May 1944, and he informs them that had he been directing Allied strategy, I'm quoting his words here, he would have been in favour of rolling up Europe from the southeast and joining hands with the Russians. However, it had proved impossible to persuade the United States to this view. They had been determined at every stage upon the invasion in northwest Europe, and had constantly wanted us to break off the Mediterranean operations. So there's a whole body of evidence stretching over 60 or 70 years that I cite that demonstrates the enthusiasm, the passion, the commitment for operations in the Mediterranean, and the antipathy, the hostility, the general lack of enthusiasm for operations in northwestern Europe. And another document that's worth citing is Churchill's April 1944 comment to one of the senior Whitehall insiders, and he basically says, "This battle," meaning Overlord, "has been forced upon us by the Russians and the United States military authorities." So Churchill, in his own words in written documents, clearly states that Overlord has been forced on Britain by the Soviets and the Americans. Britain was under Churchill, was reluctantly involved in Overlord. Now I should qualify that by saying Churchill and the three members of the Chiefs of Staff were very sceptical about Overlord, but that does not apply to generals like Montgomery, who was in charge of planning Overlord, and he was the ground forces commander when they landed in Normandy. People like Montgomery had rock-solid belief in the ability of Allied forces to defeat the German army in a decisive engagement in northwestern Europe, and people like Montgomery knew that that was a much better place to engage the Germans than Italy, where he had some experience. Unfortunately, Eisenhower, who was the overall Allied commander, shared that belief. So I think we should be profoundly grateful that the actual planning of Overlord was in the hands of two men who had rock-solid belief in the ability of Allied forces to defeat the Germans in a decisive engagement. They were much more assured of that conviction than Churchill and Alanbrooke and the other two members of the Chiefs of Staff. Here's some further archival evidence confirming Churchill's lack of enthusiasm for Overlord, and I'm reading this from my book, page 272. Churchill expressed further distaste for Overlord in a 19th of April 1944 note to Foreign Office official Alexander Cadogan, insisting that, and I'm quoting here, "This battle, Overlord, has been forced upon us by the Russians and by the United States military authorities." So I think that's very clear and unambiguous. That is, less than 2 months before Overlord, and he's making it clear that it's something that Britain has been forced to support against Churchill's, in his view, better judgment. If it had been left to Churchill, the bulk of the Allied resources would have been diverted, Western Allied resources would have been diverted into Mediterranean operations under the guise that that was a good place to engage with the German army, but in reality to keep the Soviets away from direct access to the Mediterranean. And Churchill's tragedy was that because Britain was a junior partner in the alliance with Russia and the United States, it couldn't impose its will on its allies, so it had to go along with Overlord. All Churchill could do was launch operations in the Mediterranean theatre between in autumn 43 and early 1944, which he hoped would lead to a big Mediterranean breakthrough, which would then draw Allied resources away from Overlord and into the Mediterranean theatre. But the two operations that he championed, Accolade and Anzio, failed miserably, so his plan was thwarted. And I would say that, well, contrary to a certain film that's been made, by March or April 1944, Churchill accepted that Overlord had to happen. The momentum behind it was unstoppable, so he had to go along with it, but he was never an enthusiast. And again, if you think, Churchill is one of the greatest orators of the 20th century. We all know the fantastic speeches and quotes he gave us in 1940. "We shall fight them on the beaches, this is our finest hour, never has so much been owed by so many to so few," etc., etc. He mobilised the English language as a weapon in defence of Britain. He was one of the greatest orators of the 20th century. Why are there no significant Churchill speeches getting behind Overlord? Now, the Germans knew that the Allies were going to land somewhere in northwestern Europe in summer 1944. So as long as he didn't give the date and the precise location, Churchill could have delivered his version of Henry V's famous Band of Brothers speech to rally the Allied people and the Allied forces behind this great venture. There is not a single major Churchill speech from 1944 getting behind Overlord. The closest he comes, it's from May 1944, and all he says, and this was a big meeting with all the senior Allied commanders, attended by King George VI, his most forceful endorsement of Overlord is, "I am hardening towards this enterprise. I am hardening towards this enterprise." That's not on a par with the things they said in 1940, and I believe that the reason he never gave any big speeches in support of Overlord because he didn't believe in it. He couldn't bring himself to deliver a ringing endorsement of an operation he didn't truly believe in.
Empire First by Dr. Graeme Bowman is available from Waterstone's bookshop and from Calton Books of Bridgeton, Glasgow, as well as from the website empirefirst.org. Support independent Scottish media. Like, share and subscribe to the Scotland channel on YouTube. Hit the bell icon now to be notified of more content from the Scotland channel. For more information about forthcoming films and about our mission to provide pro-Scottish television, visit our website, thescotlandchannel.tv.